This week on Inside Olympia, the debate over how to bridge Washington's multi-billion-dollar budget gap. How did we get here, and what's a pathway to a balanced budget? We hear two perspectives: Treasurer Mackley, Executive Director of Invest in Washington Now, and Paul Graves, President of Enterprise Washington.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
And welcome to Inside Olympia. Washington State faces a $10 to $15 billion budget shortfall over the next 4 years. Majority Democrats must come up with a plan to balance the budget that Governor Bob Ferguson will sign. Advocates on the left are pushing back against cuts and urging lawmakers to find new sources of revenue to protect spending. Business groups and those on the right are saying it was overspending that got the state to this point. This hour, we'll hear from both sides of this debate. In our second half, former state legislator Paul Graves of Enterprise Washington will be here. But joining me first is Treasurer Mackley, Executive Director of Invest in Washington Now, a 5-year-old union-backed group that advocated for Washington's capital gains tax and is now fighting back against cuts and instead calling on lawmakers to tax the rich. Treasurer Mackley, welcome to the program. Good to see you.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Let's do a little bit of scene setting and looking back to just understand the evolution of Invest in Washington Now. As I noted, it kind of got it started around the capital gains tax back in 2020. What was happening then? Why did this group and its funders come together at that point?
Well, Invest in Washington Now was formed back in 2020, which, as folks may recall, was right at the beginning of the pandemic. And really what we were looking at is Washington's capital gains tax had been a piece of legislation that had been introduced nearly a decade in advance. And we knew that one of the biggest challenges that we're facing here in Washington State is that we have an upside-down tax code, and we have for decades and decades. What that means is that those with the very least pay the most when it comes to state and local income taxes. So low and middle income folks oftentimes pay up to 13% of their income in state and local taxes, whereas those at the very top pay 1, 2, sometimes 4% or less of their income. And so the capital gains tax was one of those initiatives that had been introduced a decade prior, and Invest in Washington Now was formed to help to move that forward and to help build a supporter base. So in the last 5 years, we've been out in community talking with folks. We have over 130,000 folks that are part of Invest in Washington Now, who are all motivated to build a more fair and equitable tax code that works for all Washingtonians.
Okay, so I should note that SEIU, the Washington Education Association, the Washington Federation of State Employees are key funders of this effort. Of course, the capital gains tax passed in 2021. It was challenged in court, survived, then it was challenged on the ballot, survived that last year. You guys were involved all along the way.
Absolutely.
Trying to get it passed and get it sustained. So there was success there. Why not fold your tent, call it a job done, and go home?
Well, that's a great question. So the capital gains tax, when we passed it in the legislature, first, that was a great step forward. It was probably the first step forward that we had taken in well over 30 years here in Washington State in terms of helping to make our tax code more fair and just. And even with being able to pass that critical piece of legislation in 2021 and then defend it on the ballot just this last year, we've still got a lot more work to do. So even when we're talking about, with the capital gains law in effect, that helped to lower the amount that the percentage that low and middle income folks were paying, and it helped increase it just a little bit for the wealthy few, but we're still quite out of balance. So there's a lot of work we still have left to do in order to really build a tax code that works for all of us.
I want to step back and just ask, because we're going to talk about the budget shortfall and the specific work that Invest in Washington Now is doing around trying to encourage majority Democrats down a particular path. But it strikes me that the conversation about the tax code and redoing it for the 21st century is a holistic conversation, and it's one that legislators have grappled with. There have been work groups and studies about this. Not a lot of alignment or bipartisan agreement, but nonetheless, I want to challenge the idea that you do this sort of in a piecemeal fashion. Well, we got the capital gains tax. Now let's see if we can get a wealth tax. And then next up, let's see if we can get a tax on high incomes, a Seattle-style payroll tax. Like, is that really the best way to do tax policy?
That's a great question. And the issue that we're dealing with here in Washington State is our tax code and the way it's structured has been in existence since basically the 1930s. And when it was set up back in the 1930s, the economy looked a lot different than it does now. And this is one of the challenges, right? Is that right now we basically have three main buckets of revenue that come in to fund all the programs that we need in the state. We've got sales tax, property tax, and B&O tax. It's not a very diversified portfolio. And so it's no surprise that for many, many years, decades in fact, we've been having conversations about needing to fix our tax code and the way that it's structured. Now, ideally, I think that there would be a lot of interest, and I've heard from many of our members across the state who would very much like to see if we can make some big, substantial change right away. As we're moving that through, we started with the capital gains tax. We're continuing to move these forward. We work within the system we have. At the end of the day, part and parcel is, progress is one step at a time. It's just putting one foot in front of the other.
Let me also challenge another kind of tenet of where you all are coming from, because it's going to be key to this conversation, and that is this idea of taxing the rich, making the rich pay more, whether that's a large company, high wealth individuals. The pushback on that is they create the jobs. They can decide where to live themselves and where to place their companies. We're seeing right now a huge amount of movement out of California, for instance, into Texas. People moving to Florida, looking for lower cost states and lower regulation states. Isn't it, just from the perspective of Washington's economic development, the wrong message and the wrong public policy to head down this road of just let's get the rich to pay more?
No, absolutely not. Here's the thing, is here in Washington State, we've got a lot of millionaires and billionaires. And when we take the long view of history, like if we go back to, just looking at 1995, back in 1995, that was before, many of our millionaires and billionaires that we know and have their first names on the tips of our tongue. It was before they became millionaires and billionaires. We've really been seeing over the last number of decades this increased disparity between those with the most and those with the least. And one of the challenges that we have here in Washington State is, again, we are funding our services on the backs of working people and working families. And that's a system that's just not going to continue to work for us. It's not fair. And when we think about millionaires and billionaires, they make decisions about where to live just like all the rest of us do. They take a look at living close to their families. They want to live in good communities that have beautiful parks and services and great education. They make those same decisions. And in fact, there's been a number of studies out of Stanford, University of Michigan, that have looked at this issue over the years and have discovered that when states pass policies that ask the wealthy to pay what they truly owe, they don't move any more so than anybody else. So it's a bit of a fallacious argument.
What about Jeff Bezos, though? He did move.
He did move, but as Jeff Bezos said in his own words, he moved to be closer to his parents. Jeff Bezos never said anything about the tax code.
Do you believe him?
I think that you've got to listen to what Jeff Bezos said. If he wanted to say he was moving from the tax code, he could have said that. He chose not to.
So one last sort of bigger picture question, because even in my own mind, it's starting to get muddled now. We're going to be talking about why Invest in WA Now is supporting a tax solution, to raising more revenues to close this budget gap as opposed to cutting. And what we've also been talking about right now is rebalancing the tax code to make wealthier Washingtonians pay more. So now it feels like we're kind of conflating two things. Are they being conflated? Should they be conflated? How are you thinking about this?
Well, right now, the issue before us and the issue before the legislators, right, is that we are facing, estimates say between $10 to $15 billion of a budget shortfall over the next 4 years. We've seen Governor Ferguson has come out and asked for substantial cuts. What we know is that we're not going to be able to get to a balanced budget on cuts alone. We also know that making these types of cuts have significant impacts on the people of Washington State. The cuts we're looking at, really impact kids and families and seniors and veterans. And as our legislators are putting together a budget, we have to remember that our budget is a moral document. It's the way that we say, this is what is important to us, this is what's important for our communities in this state. And we have the ability to be able to bring some additional revenue in, to be able to diversify our portfolio here in Washington State if we're able to pass some progressive revenue measures that ask the wealthy to do their part just like everybody else has been doing all along.
So do you see it in that sense then as sort of a twofer where you're getting dollars for programs that you believe are important and in the process creating a fairer tax code?
Absolutely. And one of the things that we saw as well is that voters see it this way. Just this last November, we had 3 different initiatives on the ballot that were an attempt to repeal some of the legislation that the legislature had passed. The capital gains tax was one of them. And what we heard and what we saw from voters, especially with these tremendous, these big margins, was that voters not only want and expect these services to be funded because they see the importance they have in their communities and they feel the effects in their families. They want those services to be funded, and they also want the wealthy few to do their part and pay what they owe, just like they've been doing. That's the thing. We're not asking the wealthy to do anything else that the rest of us aren't already doing.
So rather than conflating these two issues, what you're saying is that they are hitched together. So in the second half, we're going to hear from Paul Graves of Enterprise Washington that the reason why Washington State has a budget gap is because it's overspent. And he's going to point out that revenues are actually still projected to grow, just not grow at the pace that they have been. And that the state has dug itself a hole. And I want to ask you to address that in the context that when you look at it, the state's spending has more than doubled over the last 12 years, the 3 terms that Governor Inslee was in. Spending is outpacing population growth, it's outpacing inflation, it's outpacing income growth. Why would you reject the idea that we do have a spending problem when you look at all of those data points?
Well, I take a look at this from a long view. So if you go back and you looked at our state budget back in 1995, 30 years ago, right? And you adjusted our state spending for inflation and all the kind of other factors in mind. In 1995, back in the dream of the 90s, we were investing what would have equated to $3.5 billion more than we currently are. What we've been seeing, and we're seeing this because of one of the reasons is because of this vast income inequality that we've been seeing over the last 30 years. We're seeing an increased need for many of the services that we provide, whether it's access to childcare, education funding, access to health care, substance abuse, mental health. All of those needs have continued to move and grow, and those are the things that our communities need. And the fact is that we haven't been able to keep to pace and be able to provide those critical services that our citizens need that will help us have healthy families, healthy communities, and healthy environments.
So if you're saying that the public shouldn't be looking at state spending, how fast it's grown, or how it's grown in comparison to their own incomes, or how it's grown in comparison to inflation, population, what is the benchmark? What is the measurement, other than just gut instinct that we need more?
I think that at the end of the day, what we need to do, and when we're putting together, the legislators are putting together, the governor's putting together their budgets, part and parcel is as you're building a budget is you are deciding what you value. You are deciding what and whom you want to invest in. And as we're looking at the budget cuts that are on the table right now, some of the things that we're seeing is, $3.5 billion in cuts in health care. What does that mean? That's looking at eliminating the Washington Children's Health Insurance Program. That's 82,000 children on CHIP that would go away. Is that the message that we want to send? Is that the value that we want to have as our state? We're looking at the elimination of Medicaid pharmacy coverage for preferred drugs. This is over 600,000 adults in Washington state who would lose that coverage because of the Medicaid expansion.
To be clear, these are not actual proposals for cuts yet. These are cuts that get you billions of dollars.
Yes, these are some of the pieces that because the legislature hasn't actually developed their budget, these are examples of the things that they are looking at.
But what I hear from, and we've had this conversation sitting right here at this desk in recent weeks, from Republicans is it is possible to cut $10 to $12 billion out of this budget and not cancel those programs. And we are in this climate right now in this country, like it or not, nationally and at a state level, of added scrutiny about spending by government. You know, the president has his DOGE team, state level, at least in red states, doing a lot of this similar sort of effort to scrub the budgets. We've had this governor come in and say, before we start looking at revenues, we got to take a look at spending. And I think there's a lot of taxpayers out there who believe that there is bloat, that there is wasteful spending, that we're not maximizing and squeezing every dollar for what it's worth. And before we talk about taxes, we should be doing those things. So where does Invest in WA now stand when it comes to those kinds of things?
You know, it's interesting to hear that folks on the other side are saying that they could find all these cuts that wouldn't have these impacts, because that's just not going to hold water. Any cut that we're going to have is going to have impacts on families and kids and communities. And especially when we're looking at the level of cuts we're looking at right now, we are looking at cuts to education. We're looking at cuts to childcare. We're looking at cuts to long-term care. We're looking at cuts to veterans. And the voters have already spoken out. Just a few months ago, they spoke out and they said, these programs and these services are important for us. We want to make sure that these services are provided to the people within our communities. It's something we value as Washingtonians. And we do expect and want to ask that the wealthy come to the table and do their part. With the Initiative 2109 went down by 64%. What that meant is the folks that voted against that got more votes on the ballot than anything else on the ballot. Every other, from the top of the ticket all the way down. This is not a bipartisan issue. Across the state, people understand and they feel that low and middle income folks have been shouldering far too much of of our tax burden here in Washington state.
And to be clear, you said not a bipartisan issue. You're saying it is a bipartisan issue.
No, when we're looking at this, like you can take a look at even like Okanagan County, right? Yeah. This last election, Okanagan County went predominantly for Trump, and yet the no on 2109,
which was the capital gains,
capital gains, won. It was the no side defeated that, and by even greater margins, 14%, 11% to 14%. So we're seeing that Republicans, independents, Democrats in the state understand that our tax code is upside down. They understand it's backwards. They understand and they want to have these services because they see the need within their communities, and they want the wealthy to do their part. And that's what we're asking the legislature to do, is as they're trying to solve this budget problem, is to make sure that they are looking at options that ask the wealthy to come to the table.
One of the things that struck me is how that request has come so soon. You know, that oftentimes it's, let's take a look at the budget, let's see where there are opportunities to cut, and then have the legislators often say this, even Democrats, right? It's been interesting to me that your organization has been out in the lead essentially from day one, arguing for revenue options. Democratic leaders have been saying. The only person who's kind of tamped that down for the moment is newly inaugurated Governor Ferguson. So let's start with him for a moment. What is your view so far of what the governor has been saying, the cuts that he has already announced? Is he headed in the right direction or the wrong direction from your perspective? You
know, that's a great question. And, you know, Governor Ferguson this is his first term. This is his first round with a budget cycle. We watched his press conference last week. You know, at the end of the day, I don't think we're going to be able to cut our way out of this budget hole. And we are going to need to look at different revenue solutions. Now, in order to bring new revenue in, there's basically two different ways to do it. You can either increase the levers on some of the other revenue sources that we have.
The existing ones.
Yeah, increase sales tax, B&O taxes, things like that, right? Most of those, like increasing the sales tax, would hit low and middle income folks at a higher level. Now, the other option, and the option that we're asking to have at the table, is to look at different progressive revenue options. And what we mean by that is these are options that would ask the wealthy few to do their part and come to the table. So some of the pieces of legislation that have been introduced in past years were things like the wealth tax, right, which, is really aimed at, the wealthiest of the wealthiest individuals here in Washington State, and asking them to do their part. Now, in Washington State, when we look at, our wealthiest taxpayers, they pay on average about 4.1%. When we look at other states, our neighboring states, Idaho, in Idaho, those same folks in that tax bracket, they pay 6.4%. Montana, 6.7%. The fact of the matter is wealthy folks in Washington, the very, very wealthy folks in Washington State are getting bigger tax loopholes. And we're asking them to, let's put forward some solutions that bring them to the table so we're not just balancing the budget on the backs of working people.
So to that end, and I want to come back to the tax options on the table in a moment, but just to be very clear about what your ask is of the legislature, is it to balance the budget with sort of a combination of cuts and new revenues, or is Invest-In-Wa now of the opinion that this should be done without cuts and with all new revenue?
Well, we'd like them to avoid as many cuts as possible because, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're not harming folks, that we're not hurting kids. Right now, some of the things that are on the table and they've been discussing is, eliminating some ECAP programs, early learning and child care, cutting healthcare services, cutting substance abuse services, cutting behavioral health. All of those things are really important and needed for Washington families and Washington kids. So we want to make sure that all of those things are taken care of. Now, are there places that they can find some efficiencies, cutting down on travel, things like that? Absolutely. We just want to make sure that we're looking at the other side of the budget as well, not just the cut side, but also the income side.
So then to that end, do you feel like the governor's $4 billion in cuts, and I think that's on top of $3 billion that former Governor Inslee proposed, already go too far or already too draconian?
The thing is with what the governor has introduced right now is he's only had that conversation around cuts. So he's really only looked at one side of the spreadsheet. What we're saying is, hey, you've got to be able to look at both sides of the spreadsheet and build this holistically.
He's thrown some cold water on the wealth tax idea. Does your organization have a 1, 2, 3 order of priorities in terms of what taxing mechanism you'd like to see?
No, we're not.
Preferred alternatives?
That's a great question. We don't actually pick favorites on this. As part of our work, and because knowing that, our focus is really to see how we can get this problem solved. And so
you're rather agnostic about which
one we're agnostic. Choose? We're agnostic about which ones. What we want to do is make sure that they're looking at a variety, whether it's 1 or 2 or 3 different progressive revenue options that really ask the wealthy to do their part so that we can start to build a more equitable tax code. Because we've also seen that, this is something that Washingtonians really support.
I know that the State Employees Union supports your organization. This governor has included their contracts and pay raises in his budget and said that's actually not on the chopping block. What is he's proposed furloughs, I think 1 day a month. But those contracts, if you were to fund them, I think over the 4-year period, would be about $4 billion. I know that there's going to be pushback, especially from Republicans, on saying the state can't afford to do that right now. We cannot afford to give state employees 5% pay raises in a budget shortfall situation like this. What would you say about that?
With the question around the state employees and furloughing
and pay raises.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, when we look at the contracts, most of us especially folks that don't work in the public sector, most of us get COLAs or things like that every year to, as salary adjustments as we're moving through. Our state employees should have those just like everybody else does. And just like everybody else, state employees should not be asked to work for free, to go in and have to do their jobs and not get paid for it. So at the end of the day, what we would hope is that the governor would honor the agreements that he's made and be able to look at these different revenue options that are available that can help to make sure that we're balancing our budget, building a more equitable tax code, and bringing in some additional resources that the state desperately needs.
And to people who are watching this saying, I didn't get a pay raise last year, I haven't gotten a regular cost of living increase. What are you talking about? What do you say to them?
Well, a lot of folks do, and at a lot of companies they do. And at the end of the day, when we look at the state employees, there have been years and years and years and years that they have not gotten salary increases.
Okay, less than 2 minutes left. I just want to know, let's look around the corner. How do you see this playing out with the governor and sort of his tenor and tone and rhetoric so far and actions, and what we're hearing from legislative leaders on the Democratic side? Where do you think this ends up in a month and a half, 2 months?
Well, I think it's going to be a really interesting next couple of weeks. The thing that, as I'm looking at this and we're hearing from legislative leaders, we're going to have the House and the Senate who each put together their budgets. The governor came out and he came out with his cuts. I do believe that Governor Ferguson is going to realize that he's going to need to look at that other side of the balance sheet. My hope is that they'll be able to sit down, negotiate, and come to the table, and we will be able to pass a budget that really minimizes the cuts, that really helps to protect Washingtonians, the investments for kids and long-term care and families, and the investments that we're making in our communities by passing some progressive revenue. We have the options and the abilities to do this, and part of what I think the next couple weeks are going to be is that conversation of how that moves forward. I'm hopeful that at the end of the session we can get there.
And what role will your organization be playing in this conversation in these next several weeks?
Well, one of the things that Invest in Washington is doing is, our members and supporters are contacting their legislators and the governors. We've already sent over 45,000 emails into legislative offices. Folks are writing letters to the editors, op-eds. They're sharing their stories. They're talking to their elected officials about the impacts and what these proposed cuts would mean to their families and their communities. And that's a big part of the work that Invest in Washington is going to be doing, because at the end of the day, a budget is a living, breathing document that really demonstrates our values, and we want to be in a state that values our people, our communities, and our services.
Okay. Treasurer Mackley, the Executive Director of Invest in Washington Now, thanks so much for making the trip down and talking with us.
It was great to talk with you.
Good to
Thank
visit
you so
with
much.
Yes. And when we return, Paul Graves from Enterprise Washington, whose organization is making the case to the public that overspending led to today's budget shortfall. Back right after this.
There's been losses every year since the early 1920s. The shoreline itself was almost 2 miles further out there. Year after year, more homes would fall in the water. We have nothing to lose.
And welcome back to Inside Olympia. This week, we are delving into the debate over how to balance the state budget. Joining me now is Paul Graves, a former Republican state lawmaker who now serves as president of Enterprise Washington, a business-backed group that has launched a public campaign to draw attention to what it says are the origins of the budget gap. Good to see you. Welcome to the program in your non-legislative role. Different hat you're wearing this time around.
Thanks for having me, Austin.
Help us, as we did with Treasurer Mackley and Invest in Washington, what is Enterprise Washington? What's its backstory history?
Yeah, we're an organization that wants to see Washington grow. It's made up of a lot of individuals and businesses in the state who want to see Washington be the kind of state where it's great to invest, great to have a family, great to start and grow a business. Because there's a lot of things that go into helping a state and its people thrive and grow, and having a healthy business community is certainly one of those things.
My association with Enterprise Washington historically has been during campaign season with supporting candidates. That's under the sort of auspices of your political action committees.
Yeah.
we're going to be talking about a campaign that's been on TV. It's even part of there's a Super Bowl ad essentially called budgetbreakdown.org. There's a website, and it's around educating people, I guess you would say, about the budget situation in Washington. So help us understand sort of how this is, what the auspices under which Enterprise Washington is doing this.
This is a public education effort. It can be hard if you're just a normal person trying to figure out the state budget itself, let alone what the growth in the state budget has been, what state taxes look like, what it means for your pocketbook. And we just thought it would be a really useful thing to do a public education campaign, trying to help the public understand the size and scope of their state budget, how it's grown over the last 5 or 10 years, how tax rates have grown, what again it means for your pocketbook, all those kind of things. There's a lot that goes into getting a state budget right, and one of those things is having an educated population. So we thought this would be a worthwhile effort.
And just to set the table for this conversation, this is not a grassroots lobbying effort. So legally and technically, you're not advocating for a particular solution, and you're not going to be in this interview. Is that right?
I'm sure I'm going to be unsatisfying to some of your questions and some of your watchers for that very reason, because this is not grassroots lobbying. This is not electioneering. We're not trying to take a particular position on any spending proposal or tax proposal or anything like that. Again, the goal of this particular effort is just public education. So there will be times I've done other interviews and I end up feeling a little unsatisfied myself, because I kind of naturally want to dive into some of the debates on some of these things. But the goal of this effort in particular is just to do public education and just to talk people through the budget.
To be clear, though, and we'll delve into this now, the message of this campaign, the Budget Breakdown campaign, is that the state's $10 to $15 billion shortfall is the result of overspending on the part of the state. That message comes through clear in terms of where you all are coming from.
Yeah, so if you look at the numbers and that's what you come away with, but that says a lot about you, Austin, I think. But I mean, maybe a little bit more than that, or related to that and similar to that, is just that it's a little confusing right now, because the last time we had a budget shortfall was during the Great Recession. Bear Stearns went bankrupt, the financial markets collapsed, housing markets collapsed, and then there was a recession that followed after it. And at that time, that wasn't the result of Washington state lawmakers' decisions. And you had actual tax revenue declines. I mean, in the budget cycle for 2009 to 2011, you had more than a 5% decline in state revenues. And so it's a little hard right now to figure out, because the state in the last 4 years has 25% more money than it did 4 years ago, and it's projected to have 10% more in 4 years. So it can just be a little confusing to figure out why we've got a budget gap of somewhere from $4 to $15 billion, depending on what assumptions you make, given that the economy is strong and tax revenues are increasing. And it's just, if you simply look at it, over the last 4 years, the state taxes are up 25%, but spending is up 40%, and that's how you can get that gap.
So when we think about the increases in spending, and when you talk to Democrats in particular who've been running the show here for a long time, they'll say, they'll go back to the Great Recession and say there were a lot of cuts made at that time, and that there has been a rebuilding process over the decade plus since. They'll also talk about sort of these intractable problems that have drawn bipartisan support in terms of funding, like behavioral health, like trying to address the homelessness crisis in this state. And then, of course, we can look to COVID, which was hugely disruptive. A bunch of federal money, one-time money, came in to try to shore up and help businesses survive that. But, they'll point to all these things that say, yeah, that line is going up, but there's a reason why.
Oh, sure. But it's also worth at the same time asking what we're buying for that money. You spend taxpayer dollars and you're trying to get something. You're trying to educate kids, you're trying to give health care to people who need it, you're trying to incarcerate criminals. And if you look at a lot of the things that people in Washington say they care about, education or homelessness or crime, while spending on all those things has gone up pretty substantially over the last decade, and especially over the last 4 years, outcomes have been getting worse. If you just look at education, the state has more than doubled its investments in education since 2013.
Was mandated to do so by the Supreme Court.
Exactly. And so, by the time you get to 2017, more than half of the state's operating budget was spent on education. That number has gone down. It's now at 43% of the state budget. But with all that extra spending, fourth grade and eighth grade national assessment scores have been steadily declining ever since then. 71% of eighth graders are not proficient in reading. 69% are not proficient in math. Those numbers were only 58%. Still not good a decade ago, but they've gotten worse. So it's worth thinking about and trying to figure out if the spending that we're doing is actually buying the outcomes that we want.
When we talk about state spending and where it goes, I mean, generally what we talk about is educating, medicating, incarcerating. We often hear that there's very little of the budget that's available to just go and cut and dispense with. A lot of it's mandated. If you're talking about Medicaid, it's $1 of state money and $1 of federal money. If you start cutting there, then you're giving up federal dollars. As you think about, and as you guys have done this analysis of the budget, where do you see the waste? Where do you see the fat, the opportunities to trim the sails?
Well, as a first pass measure there, it is, again, weird to be talking about cuts when we've got $10 billion more coming in over the next 4 years. That's just a kind of a funny position to be in. Again, during the Great Recession, you had actually declining revenues, so you simply had to cut money to make that happen. But if you look at, for example, homelessness, the state has spent more than $5 billion in homelessness over the last decade. And with that money being spent, we now have the third largest homeless population in the entire country, with the 13th most populous state. We have more than 2.5 times the number of people living without a home than the city of New York. So this is the city of Seattle, has more than 2.5 times the number of homeless people compared to New York, 6 times the number of homeless people compared with Chicago, 10 times the number compared with Philadelphia. And again, that's with substantial spending. And so again, it is worth, when you look at the actual spending that's going on, it's worth looking at the outcomes that we're getting. And in many instances, again, spending has gone up and outcomes have gone the exact wrong direction.
So to play devil's advocate on that, one could say that's not a spending problem or even necessarily wasted dollars. What's going on there is it's policy decisions on the other side of the ledger about how you spend that money. And for instance, if we're talking about the homelessness situation, prioritizing longer-term permanent housing over shorter-term shelter beds. That's a policy decision, right? Doesn't necessarily mean the state's wasting the money. Maybe they're not making the right policy decisions. But is that not... could make the argument it's not an argument to start cutting that money. Maybe it's an argument for spend it differently.
Maybe not. But at the end of the day, if you're spending more than $5 billion of taxpayer money over the course of the decade, and we've got some of the worst homeless problems in the entire country, it is worth asking whether we're getting the right spending for that kind of money. If you look at crime, crime rates, for example, as well, are worth talking about here too. I mean, we have the third highest crime rate in the entire country, with number 1 for motor vehicle theft. If you look at, again, all the things that you think you would be buying with state spending taxpayer dollars, in so many areas where we've spent, and it's spent substantially over the course of the last 10 and especially over the last 4 years, you've got worse outcomes. And so there is a world where you can spend better and smarter, and especially when you got $10 billion more coming in over the next 4 years, be able to meet the state's needs and get the people what they need.
With this campaign, and I mentioned that there was a Super Bowl ad, there have been TV ads, there's a website, there's short videos on YouTube. What was just to sort of step back again, what was the thinking behind launching this campaign and the way in which you're doing it?
It's hard even to get people to understand that when we talk about the budget, we're talking about the state budget and not the federal budget. Like, that alone is a big challenge, let alone
the fact the state budget actually has to be balanced.
And it has to be balanced, and where the tax revenue comes from and how much the tax revenue has grown, all those kind of things. It's hard to get people's attention on that. And so it seemed like it would be a worthwhile thing to try to make a splash and try to get people to really focus for a minute on the budget itself and tax revenues, and especially what it means for people's pocketbooks.
So some of the things that you guys have highlighted is that the growth in spending has outpaced Washington median household and state tax. We're spent more than we brought in. You've talked about how state government has grown 40% since 2021 as compared to growth in housing costs, gas, groceries, and childcare. I know that you've talked about the scores spending versus sort of math and English scores and then homeless spending. There's also, it's often pointed out that state spending has exceeded inflation, population growth, and so on and so forth. And yet, when you look at per capita spending, we're kind of smack dab in the middle of the states. Like, it doesn't look like we're a huge outlier. It doesn't look like we're doing something. I mean, Alaska's leads the nation.
Well, they have all that. They have all that oil money.
They got some oil and gas money. But we're 22 on the list. Kind of almost in the middle. So, you can look at these charts and you can say, oh my gosh, they're spending, wildly down there in Olympia, but we're kind of a median state.
Well, it is worth looking, but it also is, again, worth looking at the trend over time and looking at our state's livability over the course of that time too, because again, with a 40% growth in state spending over the last 4 years, if you went back to 2019, you wouldn't say Washington was starving for social services. You wouldn't say that Washington was doing poorly when it comes to teacher spending or when it comes to the funding on healthcare or social services that you might want. So there's a trend, there's the absolute. They both definitely matter. And part of the reason why they matter is because, again, to have a thriving, growing state, you need a lot of things. And one of the things you need is, of course, a strong, healthy public sector or private sector, a strong business community that's able to invest here, to create great family wage jobs, and to fuel the massive growth that we've had over the last 30 years in the state. Those things are really worthwhile, and they increase the standard of living for everybody. And so it's worth looking at, again, where the spending is going, and then what the trend is. Even if you look at the absolute numbers, it's still worth looking at those things to, at the end of the day, recognize that the state, again, it has to balance its budget. And we balanced the budget even in the Great Recession without raising taxes substantially. And again, with 10% or with $10 billion more coming in over the next 4 years, again, it is just probably confusing for most members of the public to say, why are we talking about all these cuts when $10 billion is more coming in?
I'm struck by the daylight, if you will, between those who think that this is a spending problem and can be solved by curtailing spending, and that we got ourselves into this hole by spending too much too fast. And then Treasurer Mackley, who was on in the first half, who was saying, look, we need to look at the other side of the ledger. We need to look at the revenue side. We've got an upside-down tax code. There's an opportunity to ask wealthier Washingtonians to pay a greater percentage in taxes, and to rebalance the tax code while also getting money to fund priorities. I know you're not going to advocate for a particular solution here in Olympia, but can you reflect a little bit on that daylight?
Sure.
And especially, I mean, you are a former state legislator. You know what it's like to make these tough decisions.
Oh, no, absolutely. It's a really good question. Washington often gets dinged on the regressive tax code nature for three big reasons. One, we tax alcohol and cigarettes higher than just about any state in the country, and those are things that poor people tend to spend more money on than wealthier people. We have our business and occupation tax is unique is the word because it's singular in the country. It's a gross receipts tax. No other state in the country has it. And the foundations that look at it, they don't really know how to categorize that. So what they tend to do is treat it as a sales tax that all gets passed on to consumers. And one upshot of that, of course, is that you could get rid of the B&O tax tomorrow and we could have a more progressive tax code. I don't hear a lot of that, but it's one thing that you could do. And then, of course, the third is that we don't have an income tax. And so when you look at those three things, there's not a lot of people pushing to reduce our taxes on alcohol and cigarettes. And I don't hear a lot of public officials talking about cutting the B&O tax. There are people
replacing the B&O tax.
Yeah, there are people who are talking about instituting an income tax, and that could be a real challenge. But probably maybe the biggest concern with all of that is that you could absolutely rebalance our tax code if you wanted to, addressing those things, maybe some other ideas, without at the same time growing the size of the state budget. And one of the frustrating things I always found is that those who are pushing this in particular always insist that it has to be a rebalancing of the tax code with a growth of state government. You don't have to do those things together. You can rebalance where the state tax money comes from. It can be a little bit challenging because, of course, the wealthier you get, the easier it is for you to leave the state and to go somewhere else or to find other ways to avoid paying taxes legally. But with all of that, you could still get rid of those things or modify the things that make our tax code regressive without, at the same time, increasing the size of state government.
Something else that strikes me about this budget situation we're in is I actually went back and looked at the last budget that passed, and at least on the Senate side, there were Republican votes for this budget. And there has been bipartisan support for greater investments in areas like behavioral health. And the courts required and the legislature ponied up on the education side. But despite the fact that Democrats have been large and in charge down here and have the votes to do these budgets on their own, we have seen evidence of Republican support for this, some Republican support for this level of spending. It's not all in Democrats. What do you say to that?
Sure, of course there's bipartisan support for most budgets. They're massive budgets. I mean, it's like $70 billion. And so there are people on both sides of the aisle who like some particular things in there and think it was fine. And of course, then part of especially over the last 4 years, it's been pretty wonky too, because in 2021 we got $16 billion in federal funds. This is into a $70 billion budget. That was COVID money, right?
Yeah.
One-time money that came in. But even with that $16 billion coming in, that same year the state still drew down all $2 billion of the rainy day fund. In 2022, just 3 years ago, the state projected to have a $14 billion surplus and then spent 80% of that money on new spending, on new programs. And even just a year ago this time, the state passed a supplemental budget. It's a smaller budget, but it added $2 billion to all this. And when it was signed, public officials were talking about the economy is strong, tax revenue is coming in, we're doing just great here. And so again, it is concerning and again, hard to figure out how we went from a year ago adding $2 more billion to the budget to now saying that there's a $14 billion deficit. And again, trying to help the public understand what those numbers mean is a really important thing.
What are your observations about what Governor Bob Ferguson has been saying about the budget so far? First off, he ordered 6% across the board, or he wanted his agencies to provide sort of, here's what a 6% cut would look like with some exceptions. He's now proposed about, I think, $6 billion in cuts on top of what Governor Inslee had previously proposed. He has thrown some water on the idea of a wealth tax, which seemed to be a leading idea of Democrats at least some Democrats in the legislature. What's your view and impression so far?
It doesn't seem that dissimilar, does it, from Chris Gregoire? I mean, she was governor in 2008 to, when the recession hit, and I had plenty of opportunities if she wanted to try to push for more taxes or to push to increase the size of the government during the recession, and instead passed a budget that tried to live within the state's means and didn't raise that many taxes. In fact, a few of the ones that were raised were repealed by initiative. But throughout that entire time, she talked a lot about, pretty similarly to how Bob Ferguson is talking right now, talking about the state living within its means and trying to reform government and not champion it. And I've just been struck by that because so many of my Republican friends, Bob Ferguson for 12 years as Attorney General, so many of them had concerns about the way he worked in that office and what concerns he would have, what concerns there would be as governor, but at least in his inaugural address, you saw him championing some Republican bills and talking about, again, reforming, not championing government. And it's a noteworthy development, if nothing else. And I would love to, again, say more about it, but again, we're public educated here, so I'm a little hamstrung.
The other side of it, since you brought up the Great Recession and Gregoire, is that I think that there's also a lot of Democrats who are still in office today who recall that time period, and advocates on the left who say, essentially, that was a huge mistake and never again, and feel like they learned a lesson and they're not going to repeat it, which is an all-cuts budget is not going to be acceptable. And I feel like that's informing and animating a lot of this conversation right now.
It very well could be. Again, we're going to have $10 billion more over the next 4 years than we had over the last 4 years. Again, to talk about a all-cuts budget when you have $10 billion more in a $70 billion budget is confusing.
What do you think when you look at the data points that this campaign has highlighted? What do you think is the most compelling one for making the case about spending growth?
Oh, just over the last 4 years, the state has 25% more money than it did 4 years ago and has increased spending by 40%. You add those numbers up, and I'm not.
We had a pandemic.
We sure did. And we got $16 billion in one-time funds from the federal government, and then spent them all on continuing programs, even though they're one-time spending. You know, I didn't go take out a second mortgage during the pandemic. People who got PPP loans, I don't think a lot of them went and expanded factories. They would, that was meant to try to get through the wave of that. But the state tried to spend a lot of those one-time funds on ongoing programs, which is concerning.
But then the next step of that argument is, okay, so they spent at that level. But these were decisions made by elected officials in Olympia that this was needed spending. They had one-time dollars to cover it at the time. It seems like there could be an argument that now it's time to find a sustaining source of funding to continue, because what the governor's Office of Management and Budget, not management, that's federal, Office of Financial Management has said is that $12 billion of this gap is driven by just maintenance level spending, not adding a bunch of new stuff, but just maintaining what we're doing. And if you're not maintaining what you're doing, then you are going to be cutting back. And while you've talked about results maybe in the homelessness arena or the education arena not being what we might like to see, I'm not hearing a lot of argument or a lot of examples of, like, here's all the waste, fat, fraud, abuse in the budget.
Well, it's worth probably doing more reporting on the auditor's reports. The auditor's reports. They're sitting there at the office of the state auditor, and you've got state commerce being unable to account for millions of dollars worth of spending not complying with state law.
But that's millions, and we're talking billions.
Well, this is the same time as well. Again, I'm talking about maintenance level here, but we're talking about maintenance level back in 2019. I mean, this was, again, going into 2019, we didn't have 40% more spending here. And to say that we decided to increase spending by 40% and then it has to be that way going forward is, that's not how I budget.
Fundamentally, you've talked about the disconnect you see between increased spending and outcomes. But fundamentally, again, as a former legislator, do you look at the state budget and you say, here's some low-hanging fruit. Here's some things we're doing we probably shouldn't be doing, or here's some things that if we can't maintain, we could cut, and it would not have a crippling impact. Because Treasurer Mackley said, you start cutting at these levels, you're taking health care away from people, you're taking early childhood care and learning away from people. You're having real impacts in real lives, and it's not going to be pretty.
Well, and once again, we're going back to 2019 when we still had a healthy, robust budget, and we had a state budget that was meeting the needs of the people of Washington. And this is where I find myself getting a little frustrated and unsatisfying, because we're not taking any particular position on any particular spending or taxing proposal, and so I'm a little hamstrung in talking, and going line by line through the budget. But again, it is worth looking. What we're really talking about here is that we had a ton of federal money, federal one-time money came in. It got spent on ongoing programming. And then now the argument, and this is a typical Olympia thing, is, well, we've committed to spending this money, so now we've got to spend this money. And again, these are funds that in 2019 the state wasn't destitute. The state was doing well. We were still spending substantially on education and healthcare and all the things that we need. So to say that we need a permanent 40% increase in spending because there was a one-time pandemic seems, again, concerning.
What is your observation of why voters upheld the capital gains tax? Because one of the things that Treasurer Mackley said in the first half was that was, I think she said that was the highest percentage vote of anything up and down the ballot. She pointed out that even in Okanagan County, they were voting not to repeal the capital gains tax. And that has energized, I think, people on the left to say, let's look for some more sources of ways to tax the wealthiest among us. What's your, I won't ask you to take a position, but I want your analysis of What's going on there?
Well, it's got to start with the fact that the no side on the initiative spent $35 million and the yes side spent $2 million. It's pretty tough to win an election when you're outspent 17-1. That's probably a good place to start. But there is, certainly with the capital gain tax in particular, the messaging around it was, hey, this is getting paid by a few rich people and not you, so go ahead and vote for it. There's certainly a populist wave in the state and across the country. You look at that capital gains tax, and capital is some of the flightiest stuff that we have, and it's easy for capital to go somewhere else where it doesn't get taxed. No, I mean, that's certainly something that the broad left has latched onto and talked about. It was the result of those initiative campaigns. But again, the long-term health of the state needs to include some of the things that have made this the kind of state where two of the biggest companies in the entire world were able to start and then thrive. And it has to do with a stable business climate, a stable tax climate. Those things are really worthwhile, and they really are important to having a thriving state.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Paul Graves, the president of Enterprise Washington, former state lawmaker, an attorney by training and practice. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate
Thanks,
the
Austin.
conversation. Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week.